Very lucky now to cross live to Professor of Latin America and Caribbean Studies at the City of University of New York, Daniel Shaw. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us here at RT. Now, Moscow and Havana's close relationships has previously drawn ire from the US. What sort of backlash can we expect to this clear depiction of a united front?
Good evening, Borat. Certainly, Washington is not happy to see Miguel Díaz-Canel in the streets of Moscow building this multipolar world, striking back against dollar dependency that has long afflicted Cuba, the Caribbean region, all of the South American region, all of the third world countries who've been told now for decades and decades that their currency isn't worth as much as the dollar and the euro. And the fact that they're going to they built this statue to Fidel Castro, to this David who stood up to Goliath, the Goliath of the U.S. Imperialism, definitely comes to the chagrin of Washington.
Daniel, you talk a little bit about currency there. How effective? Or you talked about the dollar and, the US saying that it's only the dollar that's strong or the euro that's strong. But how effective do you believe their plans to use local currencies as a sanctions loophole? Could that be really effective?
Definitely, indubitably, because since 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, Cuba has been very isolated commercially and economically. The fact that we now see every day an increasing multipolar world with Chinese soft power, with the Russian pole of influence, and of course the Bolivarian countries, Lula back in the driver's seat in Brazil with this new iteration of the pink tide, Cuba's not as isolated as it has been now for decades. So this is going to bring some amount of relief to the 11 million people of Cuba who have suffered for so long from these sanctions. I think anytime sanctioned countries come together, it undermines the very meaning of the sanctions, the raison d'etre of the sanctions, which is to isolate these different countries, whether it's Nicaragua or Vietnam or China. And when they come together, that can subvert the overall effects of the sanctions.
All right, fine. Let's hope that sanctions, well, it seems to be, the buzzword of this decade. It doesn't seem to change. But weeks ago, the UN passed its 13th resolution condemning Washington's embargo on Cuba. Do you expect any real changes in U.S. policy towards Havana?
Well, the United Nations has long been a joke. I think it's important to say out loud, to make it plain in the spirit of Malcolm X, that the United Nations has always been a plaything in the hands of U.S. foreign policy establishment and their junior underling partners like Israel and Great Britain. How can 175 countries plus vote against this blockade, 185 countries and only 2 against, yet the blockade stands. But increasingly, in the international sphere, the United States is more and more isolated. The headlines today in the Washington Post and beyond were that Moscow had to increase their military budget for 2023 by 40%. So now it hovers around $85 billion, which is a curious number considering that the U.S. military budget is 10 times higher at $875 billion. So again, we see who the real aggressor is in the world.
Indeed. Daniel, my final question already. Do you think, what do you make of Putin and Díaz-Canel's plans to unveil this new monument to Fidel Castro as the U.S. and Europe panic over the possibility of a nuclear war?
Well, it's clear that nobody, no official in Washington, D.C. or on Wall Street is clamoring for a statue to Fidel Castro and to Cuban revolutionary and internationalist leadership. But the facts speak for themselves. Fidel Castro in the 60s, 70s, 80s, until his death in 2017, Fidel Castro was not just the greatest leader in Cuba, but for many oppressed nations, he was the greatest spokesperson for the entire third world, for all of the exploited countries. Who could ever forget how many hundreds of thousands of Cuban soldiers who sacrificed everything in Angola and Ethiopia and Guinea-Bissau against apartheid South Africa, against the CIA, against white supremacy. And that's the reason why it's not just in Moscow that there's statues to Fidel Castro, but Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez and these internationalist, anti-imperialist leaders are a symbol, again, of the struggle against the imperialist Goliath across the world.
Nicely said, sir. Daniel Shaw, pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us today here at RT. Take care. Stay safe. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.